I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to one of the world's foremost experts in ornamental edible plants, Stephen Barstow. Stephen grows a dazzling range of plants. Some you probably haven't even heard of, let alone eaten, and more still that you may have heard of but may not have considered to be edible. Stephen's book Around the World in 80 Plants looks at perennial leafy plants from around the globe that play a big part in the diet of those living where these plants occur naturally in abundance. He's grown and studied these in his garden in Norway and selected varieties for taste, growth performance, and for nutritional, ornamental and entomological value. I started by asking Stephen about his book and the concept behind it.
Some people describe it as being about Edimentals. Perhaps your listeners, maybe they don't all know what Edimentals means, but it's a word that I invented some 10 years ago to describe plants that were both edible and ornamental. So it's kind of a made-up word, which is nice to see is now being used around and about. Because I've always been very fond about plants which have this kind of double use. And in addition to that, plants that are good for the insects. So if they're both edible, they're good for the pollinating insects, and they're ornamental, that's absolutely perfect for a plant for me. So I call so there's Edimentals, and I also call these plants that cover all three entomentals, ento for entomology. So it's a class of plants which also are readily accepted in cities and in built-up areas because they look good, as well as and I've just come back from a kind of lecture tour in the US, and there, as you probably heard, there are often local restrictions as to what you can grow in your front yard. And with using Edimentals, then it's accepted because the authorities don't see it as food, Anyway, the book is actually called Around the World in 80 Plants. It came out actually almost exactly 5 years ago. I think in a couple of weeks' time is the 5-year anniversary of it coming out, published by Permanent Publications in the UK. And basically it's a book about perennial vegetables, many of which are also Edimentals. So many people describe it as a book about Edimentals for that reason. And it's basically, it has been described as an edible travel log. So I basically take you on a journey around the world, where I discuss 80 of my favorite perennial edibles, which I grow here in Norway, where I live. There's usually a story associated with the plant. For me, often the stories, the ethnobotanical background around the plants is often more interesting, or as interesting to me as the taste and the nutritional value. So there's usually a story associated with the plant, and then I tell you how you grow it, something about the where it comes from and how it was used traditionally by native cultures around the world. And then I usually give some idea of how the plants were used in the kitchen, and also how to grow it in a garden setting. There are many more than 80 plants in the book, probably getting on for 200 altogether, but there are 80 basic plant profiles which I described. Today I have an office at the Botanical Garden in Trondheim, in Norway, near where I live, where I go a couple of days a week, and have responsibility for an onion garden there, which we call the Chicago Garden. It's basically a collection of old Norwegian onions, which were grown for food, but also a collection of to demonstrate the incredible diversity of the Allium genus, or the onion. there are something like 900 species around the world, and maybe we can grow about 300 of them here in Trondheim. So from my background as an oceanographer today, and I have absolutely no background, I have no training in botany or biology. In fact, I gave up biology when I was at school when I was 15, so totally self-trained in that. So it's I'm a lucky man to be able to go from one area to a completely different area.
Yeah. And so why the Chicago garden?
Yeah, and the name Chicago has to do with the reason we call it Chicago Garden is because the city name Chicago actually means onion or smelly old place in the local Indian Native American language. So Chicago was built on the prairie where there were a number of different onion species, which were very important food for the Native Americans and also for the Europeans when they arrived in North America. And particularly one of them, which is called the nodding onion, Allium cernum, is one of my absolute favorite perennial vegetables. Also an edimental. Also an edimentals, also good for the pollinating insects. Beautiful. It's the most widespread onion in North America, and it grew in large amounts where Chicago is located today. And it was one of the probably the hardiest, or one of the most hardy onions in North America, which actually stays green all winter. So I can actually harvest it outside all winter, even here up, in an area where we're at 64, just short of 64.5 degrees north. So we're just short of the Arctic Circle. So most people are surprised that we can actually harvest things outside here. At the moment, we've had over about 10 days of sub-zero temperatures, centigrade, and the soil is frozen down to about 10 centimeters. So this week I've been using a pickaxe to extract parsnips and other vegetables that I was a bit late at harvesting. Took me a little bit of surprise this year. But the plants like the nodding onion remain green, even though the temperature can go down to under minus 20 centigrade here.
That is a stunning looking onion, that nodding onion. I saw the pictures of it in your book and I've never seen anything like it. It's amazing. Which parts of it are you harvesting?
You can use all of it. It doesn't have it's not like these commercial onions you get in the supermarkets, but you can use all of it. And it's not only hardy, it's drought tolerant, and it's also and it also grows very, very quickly from seed to harvest. So from seed, perennials can take 3 years or more before you start harvesting. But once they get going, then you can carry on harvesting for many, many years. So this is one of the most beautiful and productive onions that you can grow.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting about that one is that it propagates itself in a slightly unusual way. But alliums do seem to propagate themselves in all different types of ways. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, even garlic, for example, you can grow garlic as a perennial where you never actually harvest the bulbs or the actual garlic that we think of as garlic. You can just let it grow, and so the next year it will divide. So the first year, as you know, it will create maybe between 4 and 10 cloves, and then each of those cloves in the second year will then divide. So you'll get a clump, basically, a bit like the way chives grows on a slightly bigger scale. And then you just harvest the greens rather than the cloves that we're used to with garlic. So most onions will expand if they're given space. They will expand laterally to form a clump. Things like Welsh onion you probably know of. the common ones. You've got Welsh onion, you've got Egyptian onions, and there are a lot of diversity within these. So Egyptian onion isn't just one particular type of onion. It's a group of onions which have a similar growth form with these aerial onions, sometimes called walking onions in the US, because they create a flower stem which you have these small onions on top, and it falls over in the autumn, and these onions then plant themselves some distance from another plant. And the next year they grow up again, and then they fall over and gradually walk around, if you like. There are many, many different onions, and actually the onions is my special interest, if you like, within edible plants, because there's such a diversity. You can have flowering onions right the way from very early spring to late into the autumn. So you've got a number of different species. You can have onions flowering throughout the season. And it's only basically the bulb onion, which isn't perennial. So if you grow the ordinary, is that what you call it over there, bulb onion, the ordinary commercial onion you get in the supermarket, that one is biennial, although it's derived from wild species which were originally perennials. And that one will flower in the second year and then it will die. And that's the only one I'm aware of, but it's been selected for that. It's been selected for the large bulbs. I guess it basically runs out of energy and flowers and dies in the second year. But all other onions I'm aware of, they will multiply and carry on for years and years. And in some cases, my oldest onions in this garden here are over 30 years old, and they're still producing every year.
What I thought was interesting about the nodding onion is it's not something that we would come across in any of our catalogues, I don't think, anyway. But that does kind of lead on to the question of a lot of the plants that you suggest in the book are, I think, probably not the easiest things to source. So is that something we need to be careful about? Obviously, a lot of the plants are things that a lot of people won't have heard of or won't have gardened with. And I guess that you need to be really scrupulous about getting the right varieties. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You should be careful if, in particular, if you like nodding onion, you can get it. There's something called the RHS plant finder. Mm-hmm. If you look up on that, you'll see a number of different sources for Allium, Sernium, there's a nodding onion. But most places that are selling this particular onion are selling it as an ornamental. So their focus isn't with edible plants, and mistakes are made. You should be aware that actually, even in botanical gardens, something like 60% of all alliums or onions are wrongly identified. And that's also true in the commercial trade, the ornamental trade. So, on general terms, if you're buying edible plants, be absolutely sure that it's what you think it is, because there are in some perennial edibles there are confusion species, which it's very wise not to confuse. Like, for example, hosta, which is one of my absolute favourite perennial edible plants, could be confused with something called false hellebore. Veratrum, which is a plant which in Japan, where hosta grows wild, is sometimes confused with in the wild, and people get poisoned. And I've come across people thinking they're eating hosta in a garden, and it actually is veratrum. So you've got to be very careful. So source your edible plants from nurseries that specialize on edibles, because their focus is on not making this mistake, because they're selling these plants as edibles. And there are a number of edible nurseries which have started up over the last 10, 15 years. Incredible Edimentals, I think it's called, in Devon. Mandy Barber has a great nursery selling quite a few of the plants that I have in my book. Edulis, although Paul Barney, he started off mainly with edibles, but seems to be now also selling a lot of ordinary ornamentals. There's a bit of a mixture there. Cool Temperate, I think, is another nursery in the UK.
I think about a third of my listeners are in the US as well, so it'd be quite interesting to hear if there's a big culture of it over there as well.
Yeah, well, I've just been, I actually visited one of my favourite perennial nurseries, Aaron Parker's Edgewood Nursery in Maine, who hosted me when I gave a couple of two or three talks in New England. Also, Eric Tonsmeyer is author of Perennial Vegetables. Yeah, so in particular, Edgewood Nursery is a fantastic place on the East Coast to source many of the plants that I mentioned in my book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I thought I would just pick on a few varieties because, as you said, there are lots of stories around the plants in your book and they're all fascinating. But there were a few that really stood out. So I thought I'd just ask you about a few of those. So if you're blessed with Japanese knotweed, can you do anything with it in the kitchen?
Oh, absolutely. Japanese knotweed is... there's a lot of negative things said about Japanese knotweed, perhaps rightly so. But on the other hand, Japanese knotweed is a fantastic edible plant. It's a very extremely nutritious plant. In fact, it contains an antioxidant called resveratrol, which is the same antioxidant you get in red wine. And you can use Japanese knotweed shoots, the young shoots in the springtime, in the same way as you would use rhubarb, for example. So if you make a knotweed pie and have a glass of red wine with it, then you're guaranteed to live an extra couple of weeks.
And everyone will thank you for getting rid of it.
I'm joking, but it's absolutely true. And it's... Japanese knotweed comes from Japan, of course, where it's a very important wild edible and is used in a whole range of different dishes, not only like we would use rhubarb. Rhubarb is a perennial vegetable as well. If you go back long enough, you'll find recipes for using rhubarb as a vegetable rather than a fruit to fill the hungry gap as it was originally. But in Japan, for example, they ferment the Japanese knotweed, and they use it in tempura, all sorts of different dishes, and I give a few examples in the book. In addition to that, Japanese knotweed, it is also a great plant for the bees, a great pollinating plant because it flowers very late in the autumn when there are very few other flowering plants available. So in fact, Japanese knotweed is sometimes cultivated deliberately by beekeepers for the late flowering. And Japanese knotweed basically colonizes places which are open land. It's a colonizer, which, at least in my part of the world, if the forest is allowed to come back, then it disappears eventually. So part of the problem with Japanese knotweed is that we don't eat it enough. And the other problem is we've got too much open countryside, which allows it to colonize.
Okay, so you wouldn't deliberately plant it anywhere, well, certainly not in the UK.
That's one that I haven't deliberately cultivated.
No.
I do have there's a kind of a small cultivar of that, which has reddish stems. Sometimes I actually bought it as an ornamental in Wales many years ago, but I keep it in a big pot so it can't escape. But apparently it doesn't spread as much as the actual species itself. The other thing with Japanese knotweed, it doesn't actually, at least in my country, it doesn't produce seed ever. It only spreads vegetatively, often because we have big machines moving earth everywhere, and it's often spread in that way.
Right. Yeah, propagated. Yeah. The other thing that I was surprised to read about, and I suspect that through the years your taste buds have developed so that you are certainly, I think, more adjusted to things like bitterness than maybe the average person would be when they were starting out. But the one that really intrigued me was the different varieties of sow thistle that you can eat.
Yeah, that's right. Sow thistle, there's quite a long, I think there's about 12 pages in the book about sow thistles. And although the one that I use most is actually an annual sow thistle or common sow thistle, there's this story from that really inspired me many years ago. I was working in the South Pacific with my job, and I would stop off in New Zealand. And I remember in the early 90s, I bought this book, Edible Wild Plants of New Zealand, or something like that, by Andrew Crow. And in the book, it describes this common sow thistle, which they call puha. It described it as being cultivated on Maori vegetable gardens, vegetable plots. I thought, wow, they actually cultivate the world's most common weed, and the one that people curse mostly about. They actually cultivate it, and it also mentioned that it was sold as a cash crop on Maori markets in New Zealand. And when I returned to New Zealand in the early 2000s, I had to check this out. So I went to a Maori market just outside of Auckland, and right enough, about 1/3 of the vegetable stalls there were actually selling common sow thistle, which to most of us is just a weed that we try and get rid of, And the background for this was that before the Europeans arrived in New Zealand, the Maori used a different species of sow thistle, Sonchus kirkii, which is actually a perennial, similar to there's another sow thistle, which is quite a big perennial agricultural weed, which is literally called perennial sow thistle. It was quite similar to that, and it was actually a plant which grew on coastal cliffs, mainly in New Zealand. And the Maori often had a long journey to harvest this in the springtime. And then the Europeans arrived, and they brought with them various European or international weeds, including the common sow thistle. And it invaded their vegetable gardens, and they recognized it. They recognized the taste, the slightly bitter taste of the common sow thistle, as very similar to the perennial, which was by that time a relatively rare plant and difficult to get hold of. So they transitioned then to this weed instead. And what they did was that they would let this plant grow around the edges of their vegetable plots and in places where it didn't really disturb the main crop. And actually, it grows very quickly, so that in any case, it doesn't really make any impact on the main harvest of like sweet potato, kumara, and squashes and things like that they were growing. So they could, and they actually weeded this weed, if you see what I mean. So they thinned it out so that the individual plants would grow bigger. And then they would harvest it, and they would use it in the same way as they'd use the traditional perennial sow thistle. So this was a plant which the Maori were using almost daily in some cases. And it turns out that the Maori have a very low incidence of stomach cancers. And one of the theories is that the large amounts of particularly this plant and also watercress, which was also introduced by the Europeans, is protecting them against some cancers. Unlike the Europeans who weren't using this, they had a much higher incidence, even though the Maori were poor and didn't really have good nutrition otherwise. So I found that absolutely fascinating, and this plant is found literally around the world. It fitted very well into the concept of the book, Around the World in 80 Plants. This was an around-the-world plant, which is found in more or less all areas. It's a plant which has even colonized tropical countries. So wherever you are around the world, there are a few plants that you'll find. One of them is the sow thistle, and there's nettles, You'll often find different species of dandelion, particularly in colder areas. So knowing a few plants, you'll recognise some food in most countries around the world. I didn't actually have south thistle in my garden. I actually introduced this weed, and it's now become probably the most important vegetable, more important than the actual vegetables I'm growing from, say, August to September. And yeah, as you say, I have changed in my perception of bitterness. I remember when I was in my 20s, I couldn't understand how people could possibly want to eat dandelion. It was so bitter for me. Today, I love the bitterness of dandelions. Now, it's maybe, I think it's a mixture of the fact that I've adapted to it, but also probably something to do with the aging process as well. You're not quite so sensitive when you get older.
Well, you kind of go off sugar a bit, I think, as you get older as well.
Yeah,
I
right.
think you lose your sweet teeth a little bit, so it might be a counterbalance to that.
Well, I completely gave up sugar 15 years ago. So
wow. Yeah. God, well, you'll be writing books in your 200s by the sounds of it. Yeah, it's fantastic. What you did talk about a lot in your book was blanching the vegetables to make them more palatable, and you don't sort of touch on too much on the procedure of that. Is there a sort of standard thing that's quite easy that people can do to blanch vegetables?
Well, basically, just this is blanching in the sense of eliminating direct sunlight on the plants in the early spring.
Yeah, exactly.
So most perennials you're harvesting in the springtime. So what I would generally do would be to the simplest thing is to use a bucket. Put a bucket over the plant before the shoots start appearing in the early spring. So this is very early spring, and just make sure that there's no if there are holes in the bottom of the bucket, then block them off, and just basically wait. My biggest vegetable is called udo, Aurelia cordata, comes from Japan, and it's on the steepest slope of my garden below the house. And I put a really big bucket. This is a giant plant, almost as big as Japanese knotweed. And I put a really big bucket over it in the early spring, and I just watch. And when the plant throws the bucket off the plant and it starts and it rolls down the hillside, then it's ready to harvest. But you can also, if you don't want to use, obviously this is nowadays mostly plastic buckets. In the old days, they would use these special forcing pots, for sea kale, and they use them traditionally for asparagus and rhubarb. So these clay pots, but they're much more expensive, as of course. But in the old days, I remember reading that it was only the rich that could afford these clay forcing pots, and they would force sea kale, which was a very popular vegetable in the 19th century. And the poorer people, they laughed at the richer people for using these expensive pots, because they believed that the product was inferior, because under these pots it was much hotter. So the plants grew in a very different environment to when they heaped leaves or other organic material over the plants, and the young shoots grew up through a mulch rather than under a pot. And they reckoned that this was a better product. So the rich people were just lazy using these big pots.
That's interesting.
It could well be true, I
don't doubt it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you talk about that actually, don't you? With one of the vegetables, I can't remember which one it is, but you said it's not great for it because you get the kind of dirt on it, and sometimes it's easier to just put a pot over the top. So I guess it depends what you're doing. But
obviously killed. But I mentioned it for both rhubarb and asparagus, of course. Yeah. Asparagus being the best known perennial vegetable, which is still available in our supermarkets, but unfortunately it's no longer. The word asparagus means spring shoot originally in the original language. Nowadays, of course, you can get asparagus all year round because it's imported from Peru and China and whatever. So the seasonality has disappeared from the food, which I think is, there's a number of different diets which are been proposed, but I think seasonality is one of the most important things in our food. Which only, if you're a gardener, you can do this, but if you're just buying from the supermarket, it's very difficult nowadays.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I know. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that brings me on nicely to my second to last question, which is it possible to be self-sufficient in Edimentals all year round? And if it is, how much space would you need to do it?
I think the amount of space depends on many different factors. It depends where you are and what else. But being self-sufficient, I'm more or less 100% self-sufficient in leafy greens and fruit. So I never buy fruit from the supermarket. So bananas, no. and leafy green vegetables I use, which is mainly what the book is about, rather than. I grow also, like I have. This is one of the best places to grow fruit, actually. In fact, where I live, even though it's this far north and it's frozen solid at the moment, I believe this is one of the best places in the world to grow vegetables. Although when I first moved here in the 80s, hardly anybody grew anything. There was just a few people growing potatoes, and people told me that the reason that the supermarkets at that time were hardly had any vegetables was the fact it was so cold here. But using perennials, we actually do have a fantastic climate here, because we have, I'm looking out of my study window here over the fjord, which is one of Norway's biggest fjords. It never freezes in winter, goes down to about 6 centigrade. So in winter, this represents warmth. So it keeps the land relatively, so we don't get really, really cold temperatures here. It goes down to about -20. And in addition, we never have problems with drought. So it doesn't get too hot either, which can also be a problem. Increasingly, in further south in Europe, droughts and heat is becoming more and more of a problem for growing vegetables. So I'm very lucky living where I live, where it's also very easy to grow fruit. And obviously, I can't grow some things that grow further south, but it's fantastic for growing apples and plums and cherries and all these things, which and we never have a crop failure, because by May, when the fruit trees are in flower, our days are so long because I'm so far north that we don't see stars for three months in the summer. So we don't have nighttime by May, and therefore the temperature doesn't drop. So we don't get night frosts when the fruit trees. So my mum and dad, who are still alive in Hampshire, hello to them. They every other year they lose all their plums through late frosts. That never happens here. So we've got a much more reliable fruit crop. So so totally self-sufficient in leafy greens and fruit. My plot is it's about 50 meters by 40 meters, 50 by 30, about 1,500 square meters. And although I do grow some annuals like some of the root crops, are difficult to get from. There are perennials you can harvest the roots of, things like giant bellflower. But I still do grow things like parsnips and carrots and things like that, although I'm growing more and more perennials, and it will be fun to try and be 100%.
The other thing that I was going to ask was about how vital it is, in your opinion, that we do use our gardens to supplement at least some of our diets.
Well, I think it's in the longer term, it's absolutely crucial, and actually using perennials in particular means that you can cultivate for food a much larger part of your garden, because many of the perennials that you'll find in my book, they're also they are woodland plants originally. So plants like hosta, which surprises people as an edible, is a major edible in Japan, for example, which you find in all the supermarkets. Spring shoots, the flowers are edible. They're delicious. It's also analyses I've seen have shown that hosta shoots in the springtime are more nutritious than more or less anything you can get in a supermarket. And it grows totally without any direct sunlight. So it can grow on the north side of your house, which never gets any sunlight. It's a woodlander. So my some of my largest perennials are actually growing in the most shady part of my garden, even up here in the north. And also perennials can grow on very steep slopes. Like for many years, I tried to make my gardens naturally quite hilly, and I learned when I was younger that to grow vegetables, it should be as flat as possible. So I started making terraces below the house. Ironically, today, the most productive part of my garden is the steepest slope. Growing perennials on the steepest slope, it stabilizes the soil, so there's no erosion. And I guess they're getting a good supply of water as well. Because my biggest vegetable, which is udo, Aurelia cordata from Japan, grows on that part of the garden. So I spent a lot of energy trying to make terraces, building walls by hand, when I would never do that today. So using perennials, we can grow, utilize much more of our gardens than growing annuals.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, apart from your book, Around the World in 80 Plants, are there any other resources, just a couple maybe, you mentioned, I think, in your book, some online resources that people could go to and just to get some more information?
To get more, well, I have my own blog, Edimentals.com, of course, where a lot of the stuff and new things that I'm discovering. There are new plants that would have been in the book if I'd written it today. There are other books. Well, I've got a big library of. A lot of my inspiration is from traditional small-scale domestication of plants around the world. So, like the Native Americans, they cultivate. Well, they even cultivated the forest, so they would improve the conditions for the wild plants, or thinning out the wild plants, pruning the wild fruit bushes and things like that to improve the harvests, etc. But also around the world, people have always moved wild edibles into their gardens because it was easier. They didn't have to. And I actually started doing the same thing when I moved here. I had a full-time job and had kids and didn't have so much time to go out and forage for food, even though it was only 500 meters away from the house. I started instead moving some of my favorite wild edibles into my garden in the same way that people have always done, because it was easier to didn't use so much time. For one of my favorite resources is or has been the Plants for a Future database, pfaf.org, which I'm probably one of the biggest users of that over the years. I got the original database back in around about 1994. The author, Ken Fern, sent me the whole database on 10 of these old diskettes, and he didn't even want any money for it, but I joined his charity at the time and supported them in that way. But a very generous person, and so I've always. But you have to be a bit careful. There are mistakes with that database, although it is being updated, and there are some plants which are missing. In fact, just over the last 25 years since Plants for the Future was created, there are something like over 2,000 new wild edible plants, just in the Mediterranean countries, which have been discovered. Because on the back of the discovery of the Mediterranean diet, where they discovered that old people living in mountain villages in the Mediterranean countries had a very low level of cardiovascular disease, scientists working on the interaction of people and plants got money to find out what the hell these people have been eating to make themselves so healthy. And so these ethnobotanical studies that have been done throughout the Mediterranean and, throughout the world, mainly in the last 20, 30 years, in the Mediterranean countries, they've discovered something like 4,000 species of wild edibles just in that area. So there's a huge diversity. The other, my Bible for edible plants is Cornucopia 2, which also called subtitle a source book of edible plants, written by an American professor, Stephen Facchiola. The last came out in the late 90s. Unfortunately, there's no updated version, but it's one of the best, still one of the best references for the world's edible plants. And it's not an identification guide. It just has there are no pictures. It's just information about the edible plants around the world. So I've used that an awful lot. In recent years, my main interest has been in the Far East, because there's such a huge diversity of edible plants, particularly in Japan and Korea, which are areas where many of our ornamental plants derive from. So plants like hosta and daylilies and the world's most important ornamentals come from this part of the world. And in particular, Japan is one of the world's, we call it biodiversity hotspots, in that Japan has something like 3,000 species of plant which are endemics, or plants which are only found in Japan. And knowing with information on that probably 1/3 of those plants are actually edible, and most of them are perennials, then there's a huge, a large number of possibilities for sourcing new climate-friendly perennials that we can grow in our gardens. So I have 2 or 3 really comprehensive Japanese books on foraging in Japan, which and small-scale domestication, which I use quite a lot. And but I have to use friends who can speak Japanese, and also use Google Translate, where you scan the pages, and it does a reasonable job sometimes in translating the text to English. Yeah, I'd love some of these books to be translated to English. Actually, it would be one thing I would be very keen on.
Well, there's a challenge for someone who's listening.
So anybody's listening, take that on, and I'm with you.
So if there are any Japanese speakers listening who'd like to help Stephen translate his texts, please do get in touch. Thank you very much to Stephen for his time, As usual, I've put the links to his website and blog, plus the nurseries and other books he mentioned in the show notes. I'd also like to thank Jackie Curry and Jake Rayson for recommending Stephen as a guest. Shout out to Stephen's mum and dad, and thanks to you for listening. I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.